How much do you know about Antarctica? Welcome to the Everything Antarctica podcast, where your hosts Matty Jordan and Jonny Harrison will answer all of your questions. We'll talk to globally recognised experts, discuss current affairs, news, and ultimately highlight why Antarctica should matter to you. Come on a journey as we unpack everything you've ever wondered about the world's most extreme environment. Welcome to this week's episode of the Everything Antarctica podcast. I'm your host, Matty Jordan. I'm here with Jonny Harrison. And this week we are talking about how to stay warm in Antarctica. We're going over the clothing that we wear. We'll talk a little bit about some training that we get before we head down. But largely we're going to talk about how to stay warm. So where do we start, Jonny?
Don't go down.
If you don't like the cold, Antarctica is not a place for you.
And episode. No, I think probably the first thing, we probably need to have a little bit of a disclaimer. There's a lot of people that live in cold climates around the world, so I suspect that probably what we're about to go through is not news to a lot of people here, but it's still probably quite useful to go through anyway.
I think it's probably a good way to phrase the episode, actually bringing that up, is like, this is what has worked for us. This is what we've found to be effective in a super cold climate. People in the Canadian Arctic or something might just be like, oh, I can't believe you're doing that. Why would you do that? But there's a few little aspects to living and working in Antarctica, especially the further south you get. Like we aren't dealing with freezing rain. We aren't dealing with, like super high moisture or anything like that. We're just dealing with cold, dry temperatures. So we'll talk about what's worked for us. It might be different to what you guys are used to, but this is typically what has helped us remain injury free.
Yeah, so this is kind of taking it through the lens of going through the New Zealand Antarctic program and getting kitted up via them. So typically speaking, you'd rock up, you get your job, you get an appointment to go through to the warehouse where you'd end up getting kitted out. And so in that kit there's more layers than you'll need, and the idea behind that is that once you sort of get down to the ice and you take all the stuff down there, you'll go to survival training, which we'll go a bit more into in another episode, and you'll actually really trial out what works for you, because like you say, Matty, it's very much down to the person as to what works, and that environment can be very different for everyone. So
yeah.
What's the typical kind of kit, I suppose, that gets provided from Antarctica, New Zealand?
So generally we'll get a base layer. It's typically a merino thermal layer. That's the against skin layer. And then on top of that there'll be a bunch of other layers. So the next one up will be the fleece. We have a fleece top and bottom. Then there'll be we call it a Primaloft. It's not a soft shell, but it's a kind of a down-filled jacket. We have a soft shell, which is essentially like a windbreaker, and then the next layer up from that is your ECW, or your extreme cold weather clothing, which is a huge jacket that you wouldn't really need to wear anywhere else other than Antarctica or the Arctic, I wouldn't imagine. And yeah, on the bottom, things called salopettes, which are essentially just windbreaker trousers, or I like to call them snowveralls. They are overalls that come over your shoulder, but good for the snow. So yeah, salopettes or snowveralls.
Yeah, and then I guess the other side of that as well, depending on what your role is down on base or out in the field, you might end up having additional clothing as well. So that might be like a pair of insulated overalls, or they even have what they call bunny suits, which is kind of like a full one piece, which is all insulated and got a reasonably hard wearing, tear resistant outer shell to it.
Yeah, I think they phased those out in the 80s or 90s, but there's still a few sitting around at Scott Base, and you see people wearing them because obviously they do the job and they're useful. So
there's always one person that loves the bunny suit.
There's always one person that loves the bunny suit. Yeah.
So what was your sort of what did you end up sort of going for as your day-to-day kind of workwear? Yeah,
so I mean, the majority of my job, not being a sort of hands-on technical engineer, was actually inside. So if you want to talk about cold weather gear inside, it was basically just pants and a hoodie for me, walking around base with some steel cap shoes on, or composite toe shoes actually, because steel caps are not so good outside. But I mean, outside it depended on the temperature really. So I've seen people who, if they're going outside, will instantly just grab their extreme cold weather jacket and just throw that on because they know that they're covered. They might overheat, but provided they're not sweating, it's not the end of the world, and you just move slower, and you can open your ECW up and it'll cool you down a little bit. But anywhere between sort of 0 degrees and -10, I'd get away with thermals. I always wore my thermals no matter what I was doing. I had them on even around the base some days just to be ready if I needed to go outside to stay prepped. But yeah, probably just that, and then maybe like a fleece top, and sometimes I'd wear the snowveralls, the salopettes, but often just a pair of hiking pants or something like that, which would be fine. So that was good down to -10. And then if we started getting between sort of -10 and -20, I'd often break out one of the other jackets. So I'd get the soft shell or the Primaloft. I often defaulted to the Primaloft because it had some level of wind resistance, and that seemed to work pretty well for me. And then down to -20, I'd pretty much just stay with the hiking pants. I didn't really need much more than that. Anywhere between sort of -20 and -40, I'd be getting into the 3 layers. So that would be on the bottom, definitely the thermals, then probably a pair of hiking pants or a fleece, and then the snowveralls or the salopettes over the top of that. That would be the bottom. And then the top, pretty much the same. Thermal layer, fleece jacket, and then probably the Primaloft jacket over the top of that. And then anything colder than -40 was basically just a free-for-all. It's just everything that we had, just throw it on. So that would be essentially what I've spoken about then, with the ECW jacket on top of that. And oftentimes I'd drop the salopettes in favour of the insulated, hard-wearing pants that Jonny spoke about before. But yeah, generally just load up as much as you can.
And then I guess that sort of also opens the question to footwear. So you've done a video on your socials not so long ago about that, and explain the different options of footwear that we've got.
Yeah, so essentially just 3 different types. You've got your composite toe work boots, which are pretty good down to, I don't know, -20 or something if you've got some pretty good socks on. But the 2 boots that we get issued are essentially like a mid-layer, and they're kind of insulated boots with, I don't know, what would you say, shin high, maybe a little bit higher. And I mean, they're pretty good, but the extreme cold weather boots that we get are like super full on. I mean, some people call them bunny boots because they kind of look like bunny footwear in the white version. But yeah, they're pretty good, and I would often wear those if it was colder than about -30, or if I was spending extended time on the sea ice or the ice shelf. That cold just seems to seep through the bottom of footwear, so that was the go-to option when I was walking around anywhere cold.
Yeah, I used to often call them moon boots because they sort of reminded you of having.
Yeah.
I used to have the song "Walking on the Moon" go through my head every time I'd step outside in them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess the other one is going to the other end, your gloves, but then also up to your head. What else? What other options do you get provided there?
Yeah, so I mean, gloves, we get loads of different options. Essentially, just glove liners, which are, I didn't really use that much, but some people swear by them. And then just almost like a leather work glove that is insulated and has, I guess it's fleece lined, I suppose, which are pretty good for most tasks. When that starts to trip you up is when you're working with, super cold pieces of equipment like metallic spanners or whatever it might be, and that cold just seems to seep through your hands. So in those cases, I'd often put hand warmers in the gloves as well, just so that it gave my hands, my fingertips, something to hold on to and warm back up. We get windproof kind of gloves, which I haven't really seen a whole lot of people wear. I mean, they're good in summer if it's warm and windy, but in colder temperatures, I didn't really find them that effective, but some people love them. Merino gloves have been really good. They're like super good for keeping yourself warm, and I often use those merino gloves as a liner for the larger ones. And then the biggest layer of glove that we get is the extreme cold weather mitt, which has I call it the snot wiper on the back. It's just a piece of fur that you can wipe the runny nose and stuff. But they're really good in extreme cold temperatures, so I'd often have the merino mitts, merino gloves inside the mitts, and that'd keep me warm in just about everything. But the downside to that being mitts is you lose your dexterity, so it's quite hard to do things that are like quite fiddly. Whereas the other ones, while they're not so warm, are really good for things like, I don't know, tightening up bolts or just random little things like that. So there's a bit of a trade-off. When you get gloves that are suited for colder temperatures, you lose some of that dexterity, so things might take a bit longer and then your hands might end up getting cold anyway. So gloves are pretty important. I very rarely saw people take their gloves off. It's just in the heat of summer. But yeah, in winter, if you've got extremities exposed for any length of period of time, it's not going to be that good.
Yeah, so then I guess moving on to your face, you got buff sort of neck warmer stuff, and then you kind of move right up to having beanies and balaclavas and everything, right?
Yeah, again, this is super personal depending on what people wear. I often just got away with a beanie and just either zipped my jacket up the full way or had something there just to cover the extremities of my face. But I also had a beard in winter and I don't know whether that actually, I feel like it did keep me warmer. It often meant the moisture from my breath would freeze in my beard and I'd get icicles and stuff in there, which could have been prevented with a buff. But then I often found with the buff, as I was breathing out, the moisture from that would actually freeze the buff to my beard, which was far more unpleasant to take off than it would have been had I just had my face exposed. Other people, go for the full buff setup and they think it's great. We also get full face masks and things like that, which tend to do a pretty good job. Staying on the face, goggles and sunnies and glasses and things like that in the summer, you're fine with sunglasses. It's typically warm enough for that to not create too much of an issue. If you're wearing reading glasses or something like that, you want to make sure that the ends are not metallic because they do tend to get quite cold. But in winter, I just grab the goggles. We've got two types. So for summer, we've got one with a lens in there that's suitable for sunny temperatures, and then in winter we get clear lenses, which are great. But essentially all you want to do is just keep that wind off your eyes and try and keep your nose and your cheeks covered up. But it's different for everybody. You probably had different experiences and you probably wore different things, but what did you typically tend to gravitate towards?
Sort of fairly similar to you. I found those work boots, they'd go down to like -35, and then if you leant down and put pressure on the toe, then it would actually freeze in position.
Yeah.
So as you put your foot back down and leveled out, you had a nice big kink in the end of your shoe, which was always quite hilarious.
I found they turned into ice blocks as well. The base of those shoes would just freeze and you'd slip around all over the place.
Yeah, and that's what you were sort of saying before, that kind of mid layer has got a far better rubber sole, so it sort of does better in those lower temperatures. And then kind of go into the ECW boot, and it's got an even more significant rubber sole on it, just to kind of give you that space off the ground to keep you warm, but also it doesn't freeze up quite the same as the issued work boots, for sure. Yeah,
and also got quite a lot of space for a foot warmer in there if you want to squeeze one of those in as well. I tend to put the foot warmers on the top, but people keep saying that that's not the right thing to do. You're supposed to go on the bottom, but it worked for me and kept my toes warm, so I'll just keep doing that. But
did you double sock very often?
Very rarely. Yeah, very rarely. Often just had the large socks that we get issued. That seemed to be fine. Yeah,
they're pretty good thick woolen socks, just sort of off the shelf, but
do
the job.
Yeah, no, very rarely double socked.
Yeah, I did find that one of the things you sort of made mention to, you don't want to be sweating, and often with doing like recreational things outside, or like walks back from McMurdo or all those kind of things, if you're walking, even if it's -35 degrees, you can still end up getting a good sweat on. And so it's almost really important to understand not wearing too many layers when that's actually important, because you'll just know that you'll build up heat in your body, and that's actually wearing slightly less, and maybe making sure that you've got your bag on your back with an extra layer so you can always layer up is super important at that time, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that, I've had a few instances where I've been sweating and you start to feel the sweat freezing, and then it just wicks moisture away from your body, especially if the wind's up, and you start getting pretty cold. So avoiding that sweating is pretty important. But
I think that brings up that whole thing around frostnip and frostbite as well, and sort of you touched on it earlier around those cold temperatures and just not wanting to have anything exposed, and it does actually become dangerous at a point which you definitely don't want any of your skin showing. Yeah, definitely.
Ultimately this is what we've got the gear for, right? It's to prevent cold weather injuries like frostnip and frostbite and hypothermia to some degree. But frostnips, it's by far the most common thing that we see there, and it's often caught early enough that the area is just rewarmed, and then it's just it's a superficial freezing of the extremities, typically on the fingers and the toes, and every now and then on the cheek with some little exposed areas. But yeah, it's that sort of stuff that we want to avoid, and we've got enough gear, so there shouldn't be any reason for exposing yourself to those sorts of things.
Yeah, totally. I found that often when I'd be doing the photography in the super cold, and I'd often end up having like 2 pairs of gloves on with a pair of hand warmers in between the layers of gloves, and that's sort of what you were talking about before about the dexterity of you want to touch buttons or do very sort of fine things with your fingers. It's quite difficult to do, so I'd often end up taking an outer glove off at that time, kind of thing, to do the manipulation, and then back into the glove or back into a pocket, so that you're kind of always constantly thinking about okay, right, and how am I getting exposed to this cold, and how long am I exposed to it? Yeah,
and I suppose as part of that, as you start to understand how to survive in the environment, it's really important to understand your own limits as well. Like you do get to understand when you're starting to feel cold and how much time you've got left outside, and when you should start thinking about, let's just ditch the photography for today, or let's just let the penguins do what they're doing and we can come back and see them later on. But the most important thing is just to keep yourself warm. And one of the things I found is you can go walking on your own outside, but it is useful if you've got a friend there with you who can say, hey, look, it looks like you're not doing so well. Maybe we'll, try some different gloves and warm your hands up, because you often see people, if they're sitting there and they're doing this kind of stuff, it's a bit of a telltale sign that their fingers are cold. So just pointing that stuff out to them, they might think that they're fine, but if someone else says it to them, they might pay a bit more attention and say, oh yeah, actually I wish I had some more hand warmers or something like that, and then you can offer yours to them or whatever it is. But yeah, you're just looking out for each other. You don't want anyone else to get injured there as well, but primarily look after yourself first, but if there's people around that are cold as well, just bring that to their attention so you can sort it out. And I think that's one of the nice things about starting off doing a summer, is that, okay, yep, cool, you get this kind of almost safe environment to kind of practice all these things, and then, oh, yep, okay, you get your cold days, but they might not be super cold, so that by the time you actually end up getting into your winter, you kind of, these things, and you're sort of like, okay, that's my tolerance personally for it, right, okay, this is where actually I need to come inside, and also those signs that you're sort of more acutely aware of, actually monitoring in other people, that you're just kind of like, oh, yeah, okay, what's going on here, and as you say, point it out. Yeah, and I've had days where I've been out there in October and it's been sort of minus 30. It's pretty cold for that time of year, but been with some very experienced Antarcticans who have spent a whole lot of time down there, and just noticing that there's a slight change in colour on the face and just bringing it to their attention to say, hey, look, I think you should probably go back inside and re-warm that up for a little bit. And I mean, people aren't super stubborn about that kind of stuff. As soon as you bring it up, they're going to be like, oh, well, I didn't realise, I thought that was all covered up. And it doesn't really matter how long you've been down there or how much experience you have. The cold doesn't discriminate. If you've got exposed skin, the cold's going to get to it. So yeah, just looking out for others is pretty important. Yeah, cool. Is there any other things that you're sort of front of mind on the clothing side of things? Not really. I think the key point is just different things work for different people, right? So getting to understand yourself first, and then you can help others. It's kind of like, like anything, look after yourself first and then you can help others. So yeah, what works for one person won't necessarily work for others. And you might see someone who's down there that just grabs their ECW jacket and think, oh, that's the thing that I need to do, but people run at different temperatures and all that sort of stuff. So just work out what works for you, and factor in your clothing for the task that you're going to do. If you're going to be outside playing around with fiddly little things and nuts and bolts and whatever, then maybe a more dexterous glove with some hand warmers is the way to go over the ECW mitts to keep you warm. So just spend some time, experiment and work it out, and don't be stubborn. If you're getting cold, just go inside. Yep, nice one. So good. Cool. Well, that's it for today's episode of the Everything Antarctica podcast, where we've talked about clothing layers and how to stay warm in Antarctica. If you've enjoyed this episode, please tune in to the next one, rate, review and subscribe, follow along, and we'll bring you something else nice and exciting next week. And don't forget to post any questions or comments that you might have. We're always keen to answer those and go more in depth into these topics and conversations. So feel free to reach out. Definitely. Thanks a lot for listening. Until next time, stay cool. That's it for today's episode of the Everything Antarctica podcast. Thanks for listening. If you want to find out more about us as hosts, you can find us on Instagram at Matty K. Jordan and at Johnny Harrison NZ. We're also on socials. You can find us at Everything Antarctica. This episode will be released on all streaming platforms, and the long-form video will be found on YouTube. Check us out wherever you listen to your podcasts.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating. This will really help us in our mission to make this podcast as good as it possibly can be. Please share this episode with your friends and social networks so we can spread the word to more people.
Until next time, stay cool.